Hey everybody, it's another week. April 24th, I believe it is. No, it's actually gonna be. I'm losing track of months and days now. I'm sure I'm not the only one. Yeah, it's May 23rd. So, it's almost the end of Ramadan, which is nice. No, not like it's been a particularly difficult one, because, not burning calories going outside comes with its own perks. But it's been probably the most reflective Ramadan I've had in a long time. It's been a nice, refreshing taste. But it's been an interesting couple days, if not weeks. Joe Biden decided to be the arbiter of blackness. Trump is demanding religious venues be made essential services. Joe Rogan's got a deal with Spotify and he's leaving YouTube now. And it's all around the same thing, which is, the virus. And it's very interesting the way one big thing, or really one small thing, creates this ripple effect. I even wonder what the total biomass of all the viral particles on Earth would be. I'm not even sure if it'd weigh up to a single human. But that's a topic for another day, I guess. So, my week's been actually pretty good. I finished the first book in the Culture series. It went kind of exactly how I thought it would go. Not that it took anything away from the book, because it was great. Then I finished the second book in the series called The Player of Games, which kind of came to address some thoughts I'd even had on the matter. Like, what happens if you have a society of gamers run by the best gamers? Because, part of me had been thinking for a while, maybe the best way to create people, to run a society would be to train them with games that model their society. But that would be like having the best Civ players run public policy, which, has its flaws, granted. Very big flaws. So the idea became, I put it on the back burner because it didn't feel right, especially when I knew of other ways to run a society that, didn't involve feeding into people's desires for conquest. So, and the Player of Games kind of directly assaulted that premise. And it was very interesting because it showed a light onto some of the deepest flaws in our own society. Namely, the idea of there being two sets of rules for the ruling class and the general public, where the ruling class sets and enforces laws upon the general public so that they have the freedom to break them, whereas the culture is a society that doesn't have laws, but as a result doesn't have crime, because there's nothing to enforce when it comes down to murder or something like that. You get socially ostracized, one, and then two, their idea of a penal sentence is total monitoring. You lose all rights to privacy. So it's a very interesting approach because it's very doable with our modern day technology too. Total surveillance of dangerous individuals. And, it's a happy compromise. You still have the rights to be you still have your freedoms, but you just lose your right to privacy. Because you've shown that you can't be trusted with it. And so that's been another layer of this whole clusterfuck. The right to privacy. Not even for the sake of doing something nefarious. Like, sometimes I just want to do things and not be sold on it, you know? Sometimes I'd like to, be able to explore ideas and not have them reflected in my search history. And then by extension having, organizations like Google or Amazon decide, oh, maybe this is what he looks for. Maybe this is what we should sell him. It's, freedom of being human. The freedom to mentally explore. And furthermore, it becomes this deeper clusterfuck where, because of the perceived lack of privacy that these institutions have with us, they assume they know more about us than they really do. I mean, to some extent, they know a decent amount enough to predict what our consumption habits would be, right? Or would be given we're not exposed to anything outside of what we've seen on their platforms so far. But because of that, we get the annoying echo chamber effects. And it's what makes these platforms so shitty. Because humans are naturally exploratory creatures, so why would we want to stay somewhere where we don't get to grow as people? We just get refed the same sort of trash that we've consumed before. I say trash in a very affectionate way. Alright. And it'd be nice to just be able to see and explore the varieties of human expression without having to worry about political correctness, I guess is the term. Because at first I was really saddened to hear that Joe Rogan was leaving YouTube, because it's, my main avenue to access his work. But then I realized, no, it's much better actually. Mainly because even I've had this issue with YouTube, like, there's only so much truth they'll let you put on. And I mean literal truth. Especially if it conflicts with the societal truth, Like, with this virus, there's been a fight against disinformation. But when the information is poor, even from the trusted authorities, right? Like, initially they were saying don't wear masks, and people, they were saying please wear the fucking masks. They got shut down. They got demonetized. They got removed from the platforms. And what makes it even more depressing is that they have, YouTube has control over the recommendation algorithm, so they can quickly link to higher quality content that, is more correct. And they could even flag, they have a full right to flag something as saying, hey, this may not be the whole truth. You may want to check this out. Which I know, from my perspective as a user, I would love to have, because it's like, okay, you're not shutting people down, you're not impinging on their right to free speech. And you're showing, the other side of the argument without making this an echo chamber. And it's nice. Because even with American media, right? Recently I've started listening to Al Jazeera news more, just because I got tired of the American echo chamber. The back and forth, left-right nonsense. I really appreciated hearing about. Now it's always Israel-Palestine, but I guess it's what you get when you're a Middle Eastern news source. But then it's the Rohingya refugees, Sweden's not managing the virus as well as initially thought, and other little tidbits of information like that are very relevant to how we live our lives. It's fun. So, with all this in mind, right, I keep coming back to this culture series. And one of the deeper explorations in it is the taboos that you get in an imperialistic system, where because they have to keep moral standards, they make laws. And because of the laws, the taboo of breaking the laws becomes its own form of joy. So even though, let's say, 80 to 90% of the population are very much law-abiding, because of the stipulation that the laws are in place, so it causes people to break them. And part of me has been wondering, how do you transition between a lawful system to a lawless system? And particularly because, people will move to that place just for the joy of being able to do things that they couldn't do elsewhere. And in the culture series, everybody has things like terminals, our version of the cell phone, but, set, 12,000, 13,000 years in the future? Let's keep it at 12,000 or rather 11,000 just to be as optimistic as possible. And they've been doing things like genofixing to influence the way they think, the way they grow, their bodies develop. But what's interesting though is that even though it's theoretically been 11,000 years of human spacefaring, I guess it's maybe just a failure of the author's imagination, right? But there's very little difference between us. Even it's a fictional work, but they comment that they're still very much animals compared to the minds that they have running their culture, which are, mega computers, planet scale computers, to be frank, that use hyperspace and ultraspace to store their memory banks in. So it's a pretty ridiculous system. But I think one of my favorite lines is that out of a culture of something like 11 trillion, something like 39 minds can compare to the predictive quality of one of their super minds, one of the machine minds. And, it's left to the question of what happens if you flip 11 trillion coins. A couple of them are always bound to come up heads for a while, for a long while. So, it's in one direction, it's kind of comforting to think, just by the sheer scale and diversity of the capabilities of the human personality and the human mind, you get a much richer tapestry of what humans can do. And it's one of the things that makes this culture series so interesting, right, is that it's less so individual characters that are, what we observe, but the culture itself. That's why it's called what it is, right? Particularly watching the culture grow, change, and deal with absorbing something like an empire. Because it, harkens back to, our imperialist system now. And I'm trying not to give away any spoilers because I still want people to read it. But it's nice to observe this sort of dance between maintaining the identities and values of the culture and having it interact with quote-unquote lesser civilizations. Because what's the most interesting thing about being a culture citizen is interacting with the lesser civilizations. Because once you've lived in a post-scarcity society, there isn't really much to do. Because of the perfection of the system, and because the perfection is created by non-human minds, the necessity for humans in maintaining the quality of the system is nil. And it becomes this own existentialist issue where humans have to figure out what to do with their lives. And it gets depressing because part of it becomes just base frivolity, people playing games just to find meaning in their life. I mean, they're the artists, of course, but then what does it mean when everybody has to be an artist? Because there's nothing else to do. There's no nurses. They're not even psychiatrists, really. Because the human mind can be simulated and described to such detail, especially with it being an embodied system, that the machines are able to more or less predict what they're thinking. But still, the human mind as a quantum system is impossible to predict entirely. At least that's the conceit of the culture series as it is now. But even now we know that that's not true. And what's been really fun about this whole system is that, being a computer scientist myself, I work on well, I've been working out how to build these minds exactly. So it was pretty refreshing to see something, written in the 80s that kind of presages my work now. It's also its own little form of depression. Like thinking you had an original idea, seeing somebody come up with it years before you're even born. But then I also knew that there is no original thought, just permutations on permutations. So that's kind of why I do this work, right? These visuals. This week's is, I don't even have a name for it yet. But the idea behind it, as always, is that you see what you're most attuned to. And I try to work out a decent balance between urban and country life, so to speak, mountains and cities. And there's this fun aspect of it where almost every frame has some water in it. And part of the idea with this is that you can rest in your own body's sense of being a water-based being. And then spread your consciousness across the fields of ocean all around the world to every single spot that is in this picture, because it's all connected to the same body, water. And I feel like things like that are the sorts of the qualia of thought that would be outside the range of a machine mind, because of the very fact that it wouldn't be operating as a water-based computer. Plain and simple. The very material that, makes the mind changes the quality of the thought. and changes the sensors of the mind. So a silicone-based mind sure would be able to access light, operate switches faster, more efficiently, but would have a tough time dealing with other minds that aren't of the same sort of material. So then it begs the question if a silicone life would be able to think more like a computer than we can. And like I've been having this whole challenge in my own work, seeing what non-human life is like, not will be, is, particularly if this non-human life has lived on this planet before. Non-human intelligence, to be more clear. Because there's this idea of epochs of life on Earth. Earth is 4.5 billion years. Like, the idea comes from that fact, right? Biological life as we know it has been here like 1.5 billion years. But what's to say during the more volcanically active portions of life on Earth, where there'd be heavier elements closer to the surface, where the Earth was hotter, where the moon was closer. Creating this tidal effect, heating up the inner core, churning up more material. So we didn't have things like massive rock monsters. I use monsters as a term of endearment there too, because what seems monstrous to us would be, stunning. Like, there's this conspiracy theory, and I hate that term, but it's just the best way to describe it, about giants roaming the earth, that a lot of these basalt flat top plateaus, which have let's call them rectangular prisms of rock up the sides of these mountains, plateaus, that look very much like bark in a tree, and sort of like the phloem or xylem of a tree that we get today. So the cell structure of these things would be rock, magma flows, and trees that run on magma. Crazy shit. And then what's interesting though is that then you get this reversal of what these trees are doing. Rather than pulling energy from the sun to store in their roots, you get the reverse, where they're pulling energy from the earth and making a temperature differential with the open air, effectively heating up the atmosphere, yes, but creating an electrical charge within them. So you have these whole crazy systems where you can design alternate biologies, and there's nothing to say it's impossible, because our very computers and principles that create the formulation of our information age now are very much the same ones that would create these alternate life forms. And a lot of thought has gone into how they would look. And what's pretty hilarious about it is that they'd look like us, just at different scales, because the bipedal form has its advantages and disadvantages, sure, but because it frees up 2 arms and leaves us balanced, we can do a lot of things. Like even tardigrades that have 6 arms or 6 legs, however you want to describe it, that would be an alternate form, but if you watch the way they move, they're not very graceful. Too much brain power is spent navigating each of those 4 limbs. So and moving limbs are thousands of calculations a second. Because it's a feedback loop of sensory, motor, placement, observation, tactile senses. And what's interesting about these, giants is that you get let's say the movement of sensory input moving about, the speed of light, or somewhere thereabout. The speed of conduction, rather. So, their reaction time could be much faster, their brain capacity is much higher, but as a result, they have to be much more sensitive to a lot more information from their own system. There'd be much fewer of them, just because the energy costs of being alive. Their caloric requirements would be ridiculous, but so would the available calories around them. And then from there it became this question of, wait a minute, what if they have metallurgy like we do? What if they built cities? What if they built cars and things like that? What would happen to this stuff, right? And then I saw a tank that got buried in mud and was slowly turning into rock, like a fossilized tank, So you have a pure, let's say, carbon steel tank, armor plating, that because it's covered in mud, has the minerals from the steel slowly being replaced by what's in the mud, and the iron from the metal is slowly leached out, spreading across the mud, converting it into a rock face. And then it kind of dawned on me, right? A lot of these alloys that we have, especially the heavier alloys, and naturally occurring stones could, yes, they're likely the result of natural mixing, but some level of it could be found in billions of year old ruins. But what happens when you have billions year old ruins because of tectonic movement is that they'd have been buried and melted and reformed maybe once or twice already. So all that'd be left would be the bare scraps, the mud that's been turned back to stone, so to speak. And I guess the Appalachian Mountains would actually be a good place to do this sort of research, because there's some very old mountains. There's some places in, I think it's Iceland, maybe Greenland, one of those places. I always get two of them mixed up. No, I don't think it would be Greenland. It's too volcanically active. I'm pretty sure Iceland is too, so maybe both places. Yeah. Oh man. What gets disturbing about this thing about, super ancient civilizations is that, well, presumptively they're dead, because we don't see them anymore. They could have left the earth. They could have evolved to a form of, not needing their physical forms anymore, leaving the earth to a more efficient species like us. But what gets even more interesting is the idea that, what if they're still alive, right? What if they moved to where they could live more comfortably? Because I could see the sleep cycle from something like this being not just years, decades, millennia. And then you have this idea of the Anunnaki. And, they start to make a bit more sense. Because even the myths of the Anunnaki, they come from a volcanically active planet. They come to Earth to gather up, supposedly gold for the sake of keeping their atmosphere. more tightly bound to their planet. But even that doesn't quite make sense. If anything, it's more that they're producing a force field to, battle against constant bombardment, which does make sense, keeping a suspension of gold, silver, nanoparticles that clump around anything. And just make, the ozone layer of their own planet that much thicker and capable of repelling anything that comes their way. And it's like, ideas like that are fun just because there's hardly any consequence to them, and you can do all sorts of interactions with them. But then the proportions of the Anunnaki don't quite fit, because they seem to still be biological. So they'd be like a secondary generation, or tertiary generation, to where we'd be the fifth, I guess, penta, whatever, generation. And going back to this idea of epochs of life, one of my favorites are the idea of wind-borne species, like hive minds of bacteria effectively in clouds that with electrostatic forces keep themselves suspended, but those same electrostatic forces are also how they create their minds. And because of that, their processing happens throughout their entire bodies rather than in their brains. So you could be a diffuse mind, you could be a cloud, you could be an intelligent cloud. And then that's when things get very interesting, right? Because we still have clouds with us today. For all we know, they could be in communication with each other very actively. Weak electrostatic discharges between clouds being their normal day-to-day conversation, maybe their communities, maybe their cities, and the very weather that we have is how they converse with us, how they move around. And then it becomes clear that they'd be in the water themselves. They would be the water, civilization in water, civilization of water, given human form. And then it's a fun dance of energy in life, because then you start talking about, what happens when these beings want to come down to Earth? Do they reincarnate as humans? Do they choose to be like us? And then it's this fun dance that gets crazy, because then the mythology of heavens and hells and all this stuff starts to have a, let's say, pseudoscientific basis, because the evidence hasn't quite been found yet. But there are still hints and pieces of it, because, there's the whole, talking to water experiments and having those, changes in the crystalline structure of water that's been exposed to positive versus negative thoughts. And, I'm sure the same thing still applies to rocks. But I wonder if it's more about the harmonious electromagnetic signals given off by a body in positive or negative states of emotion, and whether or not they're discordant or harmonious. Then that changes the crystalline structure of whatever is formed in that environment. And rocks being much more resilient than, water, aren't as affected. But then it speaks to this entire idea of a uniform field of consciousness, where the only thing that dictates whether something is more or less conscious is just the level of activity, concentrated activity. So, all the rocks are asleep, so to speak. And we trick them into waking up into our little machine minds. But we're forcing them awake as we build more and more complicated minds, because one of the fun things I love to see is the way lightning creates these fulgurites, these intricate patterns in other rocks, and building computers out of naturally occurring lightning strikes is, a crazy thought. But there's nothing that says it's impossible. You just have to be specific in how you formulate the crystalline structure of the mind before you start passing shit tons of electricity through it. And we're still in the infancy of the sorts of machines that we can create. Because what starts to happen is when you have systems that give off things like gamma radiation, the energy levels are so high, and what do you call these things? The frequencies, the amplitudes, the wavelengths, I guess, are so short that the amount of information you can pass away as a single thought, it's ridiculous compared to what we were able to do, right? So one of my fun contentions has always been Godzilla speaking, and Godzilla being magma being is got a lot to say. His brain's a yottabyte computer compared to us. He speaks one sentence, not even a sentence, one word, 1 second of his speak contains the entire complexity of human thought for the last 1,000 years. His simple hello, with the information richness of it, fries you. And then it starts to remind me of the sort of the Muslim ideas of what it's like to talk to God, right? Where the prophets would try to talk to God and listen to God, and literally listen to him in his own language, or it in its own language rather, and it's too painful. And God knows it, but tells him, you can't handle it, but I'll try to give you a sense of what it's like, and just a deafening roar, because your bodies aren't designed to absorb stuff at that level of intensity. And then one level of it is kind of depressing, because there's so much more happening that you can't get access to. Whereas a mind made of rock, even if it's naturally occurring, is able to interact with much more of the electromagnetic spectrum than we can. But the beauty of being, a fractal reality is that we can still have the same level of complexity as the mind. It's able to encompass the full breadth and scope of the electromagnetic spectrum. But our pacing has to be set to our own spatial limits. Right? We're forced to live shorter lives because our errors accumulate faster, because our metabolisms, though less demanding, are less stable. And then it starts to occur to me, right? The high energy gamma waves that these beings are dealing with must also create their own version of, what do you call these things? Free radicals, aging molecules, the errant signals that, cause degradation in their systems. So they would need to slow down their metabolisms. And maybe that's part of why we're here, being examples for them. Because humans can be immortal, but it comes in the form of cancers, because we haven't quite yet, mastered that shit. Because we have beautiful self-repairing systems, and I can see flaws in that, in the magma being model, right, where they're not able to repair themselves as effectively as we can, because every repair is less molecularly stable, because it's one of the unfortunate facts about crystal growth. The best way to grow crystal is to do it very, very slowly. Like let's say you heat up, a ceramic. If you cool it super fast, it explodes, literally. So you want to reduce the temperature by a degree or two a minute, if not every 10 minutes. And then that lets the crystalline structure slowly fix itself. So then if you want to actually fix something like, let's say, a crack, you have to get the molecules that you're trying to get into that crack so viscous that they're able to, seep right in to where things are broken. And then you gotta refire it up, assuming those molecules bind to the parts of where they're broken, where the break happened, and then slowly reduce the temperature. Again, hoping that you didn't do any damage to the previously unbroken parts of the system. All while hoping that the moisture trapped in those cracks, because of, unbinding and rebinding, doesn't cause, more fractures, more explosions. So it's this much more delicate process that we have. And it's, you kind of have to pity these sorts of structures, because they wouldn't be able to heal the way we can. So, what would happen to them effectively is that as they got older, as they started having children, they would degrade. Whereas we get stronger with age, or rather, evolution is selective for us. Time is selective for us to improve. Time would be forcing their degradation. And it is kind of depressing for them. I mean, for us to consider what life would have been like for them. And then the exact antithesis of this is the air beings, right? Where they're kind of stuck in this timeless state because they're very much ineffective in dealing with any other sort of matter. But because of the versatility of water chemistry, they're able to do a lot, but can't do very much. Right? You can cut through mountains, yes, but it takes you 1,000 years, whereas it would take us, a year if you really felt like it. They're able to reshape, it's kind of, it's another layer of ineffectiveness, because they'd be able to think as fast, if not faster than us. Way faster. There's very little, slowing down the movement of thought in that space. But there's very little that they can do with all that thought. And what's interesting about this is that if we start charting these thoughts up as being part of the ionosphere, you see that we're surrounded by this thought all the time. I mean, it's one of the things that makes the Schumann resonance so interesting for me. Because, one of the ideas is that it's like the EEG of the planet. That it's the EEG of some super, civilization that's outside of our direct purview. And there's some thoughts that, maybe they may just be, civilization slightly phase shifted from our own reality, so they have their own bodies, they have material they can touch, and they create, hard light to house themselves. So, essentially a civilization using force field technology to build rather than matter. And that's much more hopeful for them. But at least from our perspective, it's just clouds talking. And there's still the problem of not being able to interact with us, because I think part of the issues with being of a class of life is understanding your class of life and being alone because of it, right? because that's one of the kind of the deep angst in the culture series too, where because of humanity is, humanness, like we get each other, and we're kind of bored with each other because we've had thousands of years of interacting with other humans, so we keep on poking our noses in other civilizations just because it's interesting, it's novel, it's let's see what the savages are up to, that sort of sentiment. But it's a stewardly sort of voyeurism. So we, we're doing what's best for them. We're gonna help them grow and mature. It's a sort of woo goody two shoes mentality that we use to justify atrocity all the time. It's then like, what's to say that's not happening to us already? Like we're not the baby civilization being monitored by these beings. Because one of the things that happens, right, is because of the way that early cloud formation would have been happening on Earth, right? And if these magma beings existed, like you'd have full cloud cover over the entire planet, or very high cloud cover. And let's say there's conversations and torrential raining happening, which happened like before we had oceans. Yeah. So it would have been a war between heaven and earth. Like, just cooling down the surface of the planet enough for our generation of life to live. And it becomes this whole, like, it's a crazy drama, because from their perspective, like, the heavens are doing battle with the earth. Like, how much more biblical can you get than that? Like, Milton couldn't have thought of something like this, because it's quite literal. And it's forced by physics. But there's physics and then there's consciousness, and like those two levels of the conversation have never really reconciled. But like, I'd say, I forget how long it was for the oceans to be created, but in that span of time, because the surface that would be the ocean floor would have been covered in hot magma, basalt, and volcanic eruptions happening constantly, because the earth is still young and the moon is still pulling up and churning up the inner workings of the planet. So that war would have been epic. And calling it a war is kind of dumb anyway, but lightning strikes the planet constantly, the same electromagnetic discharges. But because charges build up on Earth too, lightning flows up. I mean, you still see it on Earth in some places where lightning comes from the ground rather than going to the sky, but it's a constant back and forth then. And it's happening everywhere. Boom, boom, boom. And those conditions are exactly the sort of conditions you need to spawn these sorts of, how do I say, magma mines. Because what can happen because the Earth is so warm is that the magma cools much slower than it does today. Like, most magma cools very fast comparatively to, what we see in, what's this place? Hawaii right now, because it's exposed to cool air and ocean water. So it's, the crystalline structure of what emerges is very different than, let's say, if you had the average temperature on Earth be 2,000 degrees, and it takes, or even 500 degrees, right? But you're coming out from this 2,000 degree environment, so you're cooling by a degree every few hours, if not days. And it gets a very different world. Oh man. And then you have people like Joe Biden deciding, okay, a lot of this politics nonsense just becomes inconsequential when I start thinking about things like that, because like the difference between humans is so small. Like, why even bother making this distinction of race when you still eat the same food, speak the same language? Like, Race is so little, but I guess it's so much when there's so much that you don't see, right? And it's like I've had this issue with economics recently too, right? Because this idea of like, economics as being the field of competition between, you know, entities, between people, and like to that extent it makes sense, but then it's people competing against other people. Yes, to a point. But what if economic theory is really about people competing against the forces of nature, right? Society is formed to fight against extinction. Like that's why we're really in cities, right? That's why cities formed. It's safer in groups. That's why schools of fish form. It's safer in a group than swimming out alone, than getting eaten one at a time. And I feel like we lose a lot of that perspective because, I mean, our lives are short, so we have short histories. We don't remember the catastrophes of years past. And it's depressing. Yeah, not really. I say depressing as like a catch-all term of existentially angst-inducing. And like I like that angst. It's kind of where I do my best thinking. Oh man, because when you see economics as not a battle between humans, but a battle between forces. Like it's energy allocation for the process of maintaining coherent thought in a myriad of forms. You start to see that the cloud civilization kind of had its heyday and they're in decline today. Like because part of what also happens with that civilization is that they get washed away into space just by the way the solar radiation interacts with the upper atmosphere. So they've got that level of attrition happening that they've been fighting off for millennia, becoming interstellar dust. Well, on the ground here, we're contending with, global warming, global cooling, maintaining a decent albedo level for the planet. And it's like the question of race and politics when humanity still shares the same food needs, we still share the same water needs, we still share the same needs for affection, needs for communication, needs for exercise. Like there's so much more we have in common than is different between us that it's just so dumb. It's like I'd love it if a politician would just say I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not even an independent, I'm just a dude. Like if you wanted these are my goals. I don't really particularly care if they mend with one political party or another, but here they are. I think it'll help more people than it hurts. And if it hurts people, these are the measures that we can take to fix them. And these are the measures that we can take to observe these suggestions to make sure that we're not making things worse, right? Because I feel like politicians have this idea of the perfection of their thought in terms of policy making, and with the crime bills and all this crap, we've repeatedly seen that they're imperfect thoughts, they're flawed, and they should have a shelf life. And sure, built in are 10-year revisions where after a given amount of time they've got to be reapproved. But it's still lazy policy making in my view, because they don't make how do I say these things? They don't make clear the goals that they need to meet to deem themselves as having achieved what they set out to achieve. What is it? If the Patriot Act had said, if we don't have any terrorist attacks for a 5-year span, or it's shown that there's no benefit from having this level of monitoring of the citizenry, well, this bill becomes null and void. That would be good lawmaking, because we don't have more junk laws that we then have to go back into the books to start repealing one at a time. And because part of it is this this idea of switching to a lawless society, and even the conception of a lawless society is so alien to us that it automatically harkens ideas of anarchy. And even anarchy, not anarchy as in no laws, but anarchy as in chaos, rebellion, violence. And that's kind of the powerful difference of all this, because anarchic systems can be peaceful. What is it? Nasty British short lives versus pastoral, peaceful, and plentiful. But it's only possible to have a peaceful anarchy if you have overabundance, where it's not necessary to organize around methods of stealing from one another. In order to do that, you have to have an organization of the economic system to guarantee plenty for everyone, energy-wise, food-wise, all this stuff. But that can all be calculated pretty easily. But the problem is that you can't make a profit. But even saying profit is the wrong way of going about it, because you can still produce grain in a way that adds more to the soil. You can still extract metals and mineral resources while making it easier to extract more metal later, all without damaging the environment with chemicals. Yeah, but that's changing the refining processes so that when you're extracting one alloy from another, you maintain the waste to recycle it for later uses, and then you dictate the directions of the extraction of resources such that the waste products are still useful for things down the supply chain. So let's say you're extracting metal alloys, like iron, let's say, and iron tends to be bound in oxides, so you have oxygen being produced. Okay, oxides with manganese and what else? Chromates. No, I don't think chromates naturally, but yeah, naturally occurring rust. Okay, so you extract the metal using chemical bath that binds more with the oxygen than with the iron. So, well, it's usually an acid. So, yeah, it creates a mess. But then if you're able to do this extraction solely with, harvested solar energy, where you melt the iron first and then free the oxygen to then form with hydrogen that you electrolyze. So you have, you extract the oxygen from the water, let that float back into the atmosphere, and then use the hydrogen to then bind with the oxygen coming from the metal. So it's a different, way of doing the same metal extraction with zero waste. And then, what is it? Gold is another fun one, where they use, I think, mercury to make amalgams with gold. And then they have to boil away the mercury. And that's an interesting problem, right? But mercury is a very interesting metal too, because it's superconducting at low temperatures. So you can still use the mercury amalgam with gold, and you may even want to keep it as the amalgam, instead of boiling it away, but people want their pure product. So one thing you can do, right, because depends what the molecular weight of mercury is versus something like gold. And if you can do something like instead of letting the mercury boil away, you keep it in a closed container where you can then reharvest and distill the mercury back down. So you get the amalgam in a ball, you get the waste product removed from the free gold, because gold, when it's in the ground, it's still not bounded to anything. It's just surrounded by a lot of other crap. So what the mercury does is that it helps fuse with just the gold and makes it easier to extract it when you're pouring it and melting it. So it'd be an interesting thing to put mercury amalgam in a vacuum chamber, and then letting that resettle, and then doing a second layer distillation process where you heat the amalgam up. You collect the mercury back down in another chamber. It'd be fun. It'd be much more environmentally friendly though, because you don't look at mercury going into rivers, right? And then you can reuse the mercury for all sorts of crazy shit, because it's apparently one of the best starship fuels imaginable. And oh my god, this week has been crazy. So I started researching, it's always on the back burner, researching starship tech, best fuel sources, best, that sort of thing. And I was disappointed that the energy density of hydrogen wasn't friendly enough to make a hydrogen fuel cell ship kind of realistic. But then there's this whole layer of chemicals that are pretty energy dense, also stable at high temperatures. So it takes a decent amount of energy to set the reaction off, but once it's going, it's going. And because the fuels are so dense, I don't want to say what fuels they are, just because people listening, because they're so energy dense, you can pack tons of the fuel in small areas and produce it from biological processes. So it's a self-feeding symbiotic cycle between the users of the ship and the propellant in the ship. But this is all sublight speeds. And it's I wonder what would happen if we changed the way we taught chemistry to, aim towards these sorts of complete reactions. Reaction cycles where, the Krebs cycle. That's the way our body works anyway. Molecular cycles keeping the same reagents in use again and again. And the output is energy, for the most part, with a few, oxygen ions that are still part of larger cycles. But, what'll happen is that eventually we lose. It's not that we lose anything, it's more that we don't maintain the balance of molecules we need to keep the cycles as efficient as possible, right? You don't maintain the levels of vitamin C to absorb the free radical oxygens. You don't, maintain enough vitamin D to absorb to keep the bones healthy, to maintain the calcium levels that we need to keep the ion channels pumping, that sort of thing. So it's a dance. It's all a dance, but a dance happening at the molecular level that is only taught to biology students, but even they just know it because it's there, not because it's the way that we can design things. right? If you taught biological principles to deep chemistry students, not organic chemistry students, but every chemistry student, it changes the way, you know, the chemical processes are designed for industry. And the same thing for physics, right? Because, there's like more, what do you call it, interdisciplinary study happening now between, let's say, physics and, between all the fields, just because there are more people now to fill those niches in the thought. But if we take a hardline approach to breaking up the old schools of hyper-specialized thought and then including more generalistic thinking, we can get a deeper, I wouldn't even say deeper, more nuanced appreciation into the processes that we can create to better organize the planet. Because, today's spew is a mix of biology and physics and theology and psychology and all that fun stuff. Definitely chemistry. But, none of which I'm certified to have studied, but whatever. Alright. I think it's an hour. It's been going a little long. It's 5 a.m. Oh, it's 6 a.m. now. Fuck, I gotta get to sleep. And get this thing up. It's been fun, guys. Peace.